This program is made possible in part by the Maryland Humanities Council and the Columbia Film Society. Michael Collier talks with E. Ethelbert Miller.
Welcome to The Writing Life. My name is Michael Collier, and today's program features poet Ethelbert Miller. Ethelbert Miller is also an arts administrator, editor. He's an investor in the bookstore Vertigo in Washington, D.C., and he will be reading from his poems as well as talking a bit about what it's like to do the many things he does. I thought we would start today with asking Ethelbert to read a poem. And you know, Ethelbert, the poem that I thought might be good for you to begin with is "Only Language Can Hold Us Together."
Okay. Only language can hold us together. I watch the women bead their hair, each bead a word, braids becoming sentences. She would never comb her hair. It was always wild, like new poetry. It was difficult to understand. She would enter rooms where old women would stare and mumble, and bold ones would say, "Where's her mother?" She never understood why no one ever understood the beauty of her hair. Like free verse, so natural as conversation, so flowing like the French or Spanish she heard or overheard she thought she knew. "I want to go to Mozambique," she said one day, combing her hair, finding the proper beads after so long. "I want to go to Mozambique," she said, twisting her hair into shape, the way her grandmother made quilts, each part separated and plaited. "I want to go to Mozambique or Zimbabwe or someplace like Luanda. I need to do something about my hair. If only I could remember the words to the language that keeps breaking in my hands."
I think one of the reasons I wanted to begin with that poem is language in its, as it relates to very small details, personal details, seems to be very important in your work. And so I was curious about some of the sources of your poetry, where you found that the poems begin, or even maybe where in your past, even before you started to write poems, what you began to notice about experience.
Well, I notice in terms of some of the most recent things I've written, my mother's voice is in my poetry. Sayings that I grew up with around the house is there. Some of the poems the last few years have been taken from things I've heard in the street. I encourage all people who are writers to keep their ears and eyes open, you know, in terms of some fascinating things in terms of language that we sometimes take for granted. And so what happens is that I try to draw from things which are ordinary, as well as things in terms taken from reading, in terms of inspiration.
Do you remember when you wrote your first poem? Where it came from?
I know that during the late 60s, around like 68, 69, I was writing quite a number of poems back home to family and friends in New York City. And that was a time in which I guess we were very avant-garde. We were writing on envelopes, you know, things of that sort. And so much of my early work began there. I didn't start out like some of my friends in terms of writing poetry at a very early age. Around the time of 7, 9, 10, or 11, I was pretty much drawing.
And do you still draw?
I still draw. I don't draw as much as I used to. One person in my family who used to draw as well as take pictures in terms of photography was my father. And it's only now my father is deceased, and I look back and try to keep his memory alive, that I go back and now I'm looking at my father as an artist. You know, many times we don't grow up in terms of defining our fathers that way. He's the person who's putting, you know, food on the table and then having a roof over our heads. But, you know, my father was very active as a photographer just before I was born. And during the time of me coming of age, he had given that up. But every now and then I would catch him like in the bed drawing or sketching.
Well, did he make his living through photography?
My father started out actually as a maintenance man. In fact, going back, I have to mention that my father came to this country as a little boy from Panama. Did not obtain, you know, a real good formal education. took a lot of pride in terms of raising children who were able to obtain the education that he could not receive. And from being a maintenance man, he went into the post office.
Yeah.
I guess like Richard Wright and there's many others. And the post office provided him with a livelihood and opportunity to provide for his family. I take pride in that in terms of one of the things I'm doing now is writing more about my father because even though the life on one level doesn't seem heroic, I believe it is. He was able to raise a family at a time when many people go back and look at our communities and say, okay, some of these communities are in crisis or confronting problems. My father was able to deal with those crises, with those problems, and still raise us successfully.
Yeah. Is there a poem about your father that you could read?
Well, there's a poem here which is about my brother, but it's actually about my father also, because one of the things I look at, and I just written an essay on this, is I'm amazed that my brother, went into the monastery in terms of the early 60s, and I interviewed my brother when he came out of the monastery. And he informed me that the major influence on his life to encourage him to go into the monastery was my father. And for many years, I thought like my brother went to the monastery because he was like many other young men around the 1960s who came in contact with the writings of Thomas Merton. And I thought that had opened the door. But talking to my brother, he felt and told me that the spiritual image and model was our father. And this is a poem 1962, my brother Richard enters the monastery. And this is a major thing for my father to agree to let my brother go into the monastery. That's a major step in terms of permission. What do I remember? Not much. The trip to LaGuardia Airport. Not too many colored people were flying in those days. One had to walk out to the airplane. I remember that. A number of us, family and friends, had gone to see him off. We laughed at Richard. We laughed at Richard's head in the plane's window. We were surprised we could see him and that he could see us. We kept waving until the plane turned around, slowly went down the runway, took to the air, and flew. My brother was gone. It would be years before I understood that he could have been gone forever. I think that evening my father went to work as usual. My mother fell across the bed in her room, crying. My sister told me to hush and be quiet. I was the youngest, the baby, the other. How was I to understand the Lord's calling? Now, you mentioned about my father. In that poem, it's a very interesting thing, that here this major change in our family takes place. My father goes to work. See, business as usual. And I remember my mother who was like devastated in terms of my brother going to the monastery, and she was crying in the room. But my father went to work. And that says something about that relationship.
It's also interesting about your father. I was thinking about my own father, and who was a traveling salesman most of his life. Yet he had been an amateur photographer. And all through my childhood, the service porch was filled with equipment that he never used again. And it always stuck in my mind that here was something he did that he gave up. And I've thought about that a lot as I've written poems. And just listening to you, it's clear that I think often we fulfill something that perhaps our parents didn't complete or try to fulfill. Not that we're completely successful, and we're not even aware of it. It's sort of always there.
Well, I'm aware of it in terms of what you just said. I think for me, it's one reason why I write. You know, I write to sort of document my father's life. And it's a challenge, and it's also a labor of love.
There's so much you document. I mean, one of the things that I find very interesting about your work is really how Catholic it is, how broad. And in some ways it reminds me of William Stafford's instrument in that he was able, just by paying attention to what was around him and being involved with the world, to make everything he saw partake in poetry.
Well, you want to be open in terms of one, I would also think of not only Stafford, but also Neruda, on which everything, you know, whether it's a cup or a table, is subject matter for poetry.
One of the things that you've done that I think is very important is your role as the director of the African American Resource Center at Howard University. Do you want to talk just a little bit about how that fits in with your life as a writer? In some ways, it's much different than writing, but it's completely connected to it as well.
Well, I think, you know, I've been fortunate to be in the same job since 1973, and many people can't say that for reasons of downsizing and things of that sort. But being in the same place has enabled me to do what I feel I do very well now, and that's network. I look at my involvement in terms of African American culture, and I could say that not only in terms of literature, in which the number of writers that I come in contact with or stay in contact with is very high, but if, for example, we talk about African American filmmakers, many of the major African American filmmakers I'm in touch with on a regular basis, helping them in terms of scripts and things of that sort. I take pride in that. I also realized that what I'm doing in terms of my job was the change that I saw take place in my life in terms of the commitment I made when I was in college. I made a commitment to African American culture, not in terms of this was a trendy thing to do, but the fact that this was something I was committing my life to. That's why I stayed at Howard. That's why I helped in terms of the development of the African American Studies program at Howard. You know, when I came in, that program was not there. That was a student demand, a student issue, and many of us who entered the program was, you know, for me, one of the first graduates. But it's an ongoing commitment and love in terms of trying to share the knowledge that when I look at my life growing up in New York, I didn't have. You know, if someone was to pull me aside in junior high or high school, I couldn't tell you about Phyllis Wheatley. I couldn't tell you about Dunbar or Langston Hughes. Only by coming to Howard and committing myself to that institution did it change my life. And I feel I've made a contribution that is considerable right now as I move towards being 50.
Well, I know that one of the contributions you've made is really not only to create a community in the Baltimore, Washington area. When I first moved here in '83, I don't know how many people mentioned your name to me when I came, but also now, just so many people throughout the country know of your work. And it seems as if the anthology, In Search of Color Everywhere, which you edited, is in some ways a fruition of that.
Right. I think, you know, when I look at that, one person I have to thank for this book would be the literary grandmother, I guess. Maybe she might want, maybe say godmother, she liked that better. And that's Marie Brown in New York. Marie Brown was not my agent, but she was in a room in a publishing company in New York, and the company, Stewart, DeBoer and Chang, wanted to do an anthology. And they had some names that they had threw out. And Marie Brown was saying, okay, if anyone's going to do this anthology, it should be Ethelbert Miller. And that was just her knowledge and trust in me, which we had developed over a series of years in terms of helping her with other writers. And what she was able to help me do is something that was always in the back of my mind. You know, I was fortunate while at Howard to be around a number of people who have given us very important literary anthologies. One, Sterling Brown, another, Arthur B. Davis, a third, my teacher, Stephen Henderson. And from them, I learned exactly how to put together an anthology. You know, one thing that you see immediately, you know, with people like James Brown and Public Enemy in this book, is I learned from Stephen Henderson. And that is, if we're going to talk about African-American literature, we have to acknowledge, you know, the oral tradition. And so we're in his anthology, Understanding the New Black Poetry, which came out in '69, he had like the work songs and spirituals. I have the work songs and spirituals, but I brought it up to like rap and, and James Brown, Precious Lord is in here, you know, all these things which I feel is part of our literary tradition. And I learned from him, and I feel I could not have done this unless I had good teachers, and I did.
We read a poem that...
I'll read a poem, since we're doing this taping. I'll read a poem which everyone usually knows about, but has the wrong title. This is by Langston Hughes, Mother the Sun. Many times when people go into the library looking for this poem, they're saying, oh, I'm looking for this poem, Crystal Stair by Langston Hughes. And actually the title of the poem is Mother the Sun. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It had tacks in it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, I's been a-climbing on, and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps 'cause you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. And that's Langston. That was written actually in the 20s when Langston had dropped out of Columbia. He was having problems trying to find a job, and he's coming home one day disappointed, and he encounters his landlady. And his landlady gives him this encouragement to not to give up. And when we look at that poem, I think it says so much in terms of, for our society now, in terms of two generations. The older people are telling younger people who feel that things come very easy, that no, you have to work for things. There is a struggle, and you have to make sure you don't give up. And so this is a poem, I think, that it's a wonderful poem. It's one of Langston's signature poems, just like I've Known Rivers and The Weary Blues, that people love and recite quite often.
The anthology ends with the Robert Hayden poem.
Right.
And I also was thinking how Michael Harper and Anthony Walton's recent anthology begins with Robert Hayden.
Yeah. Well, Hayden, what I did, this book, this anthology is unique in that you can read it like you would a collection of fiction. Every poem follows the next. So if, for example, we go to the end and we see American Journal by Robert Hayden, which, when we examine that poem, it's like the extraterrestrials, coming down, looking at Earth and looking at this country, America. Well, that's the last poem. But we go back to the first poem in the anthology. It's The Creation by James Weldon Johnson. So we see this sort of like X-File, dark sky phenomenon. Right. This whole sort of extraterrestrial, this whole sort of space, which on another level, what are we talking about? We're talking about universality in terms of experience. So here we have a collection which is a body of African-American literature set in that tradition, but speaks to everyone in terms of its beginning as well as its end.
In terms of someone like Hayden, I know that he took a lot of heat in the late 60s and the early 70s for sort of not being on the right...
Oh, that's to be nice. He caught hell.
the right side. Have things healed over a little bit? I mean, is he...
Well, I think so. Some of the people, we can put this in context. Robert Hayden was teaching at Fisk University. Fisk University becomes very important, especially around 1966-67, when the novelist John Killens organizes a Black Writers Conference on the campus of Fisk. At that time, one of the people there is Nikki Giovanni. It's in the midst of what we will begin to see or define as the Black Power era, and the Black arts. And what happens, a number of the young writers begin to emerge. This becomes a very important conference for the writer Gwendolyn Brooks, because I think Gwendolyn Brooks leaves Hamilton College, upstate New York, and flies to Fisk and is like baptized by all this black poetry and makes the statement about how Don Lee looks like a black Jesus. I remember all that. And in the midst of that, people are criticizing Robert Hayden. And keep in mind that Robert Hayden's life was shaped by the fact that he was a follower of the Baha'i faith. Right. So in the midst of all this nationalism, here's a person who's talking about the human spirit, about universality. And the one person who was close to him, who has documented the pain that that was inflicted on Hayden, was the writer Julius Lester. And a number of people, Don Lee, Hakeem Adabuti, was very critical of Hayden. And it wouldn't be until years later that people realized that here, these young writers caught up in blackness and expressing themselves in this new black consciousness, could not acknowledge that the one writer who had mastered and has written some of the best poems dealing with the African-American experience in terms of history and culture was Robert Hayden. Robert Hayden, the Frederick Douglass poem, Renegade, Renegade. All these are classic poems written by this man who understood the beauty of blackness and did not deserve to be ridiculed. And we look back at that period of time in which many older people were attacked by younger people. Some rightfully so, I must admit. But for others, it was a thing in terms of it was a sad point in terms of American letters.
I was a student of Hayden's in '74, and I remember he was still suffering greatly from it. But what was interesting about it was that he was so clear of its source. He understood it in a way, and was sort of waiting for it to pass.
Right, and it has passed.
And he knew he would. It would. Unfortunately, he's not here to to see it.
But you know one thing in all respect, people like Donley, Hakeem Adabuti, after Hayden passed away, were very, very open about the fact that, you know, coming through that period, they were wrong.
They had missed it, yeah.
Right, exactly. And that takes the courage to say and admit.
Yeah, definitely. I was wondering, too, that some of the things you've been involved in have to do with political activism. And there was one poem that I was hoping you would read. It's called I Am the Lord, a poem in memory of Oscar Romero.
All right. Oscar Romero, this is one of the few poems that I was actually invited to write. During the late 70s, early 80s, I was invited by many people within the Nicaraguan and also the Salvadorian, as well as people from Chile, because there were a number of movements and struggles going on. I became very close, for example, to the novelist Ariel Dorfman, and a major influence, I think, on my work. And I was pulled into these communities, and I took risk in my own work, because I started writing about land and about people that I had not seen. And so there was a risk. And eventually I would take some trips and visit and see things for myself. But many of the poems I wrote just listening to people and serving as a medium. I mean, land, a poem in memory of Oscar Romero. I am the land, I am the grass growing, I am the trees, I am the wind, the voice calling, I am the poor, I am the hungry. The doors of the church are open, as wide as the heart of a man. In times of trouble, here is a rock, here is a hand. God knows the meaning of our prayers. I have asked our government to listen. God is not dead, and I will never die. I am the land. I am the grass growing. I am the trees. I am the wind, the voice calling. I am the poor. I am the hungry. He who is resurrected is revolutionary. He who is resurrected believes in peace. This is the meaning of light. This is the meaning of love. The souls of my people are the pages of history. The people of El Salvador are the people of the world. I am Oscar Romero, a humble servant. I am the land. I am all the people who have no land. I am the grass growing. I am all the children who have been murdered. I am the trees. I am the priests, the nuns, the believers. I am the wind, the voice calling. I am the poets who will sing forever. I am the poor. I am the dreamer whose dreams overflow with hope. I am the hungry. I am the people. I am Oscar Romero. You know, one thing which I must mention, I wrote this poem for a specific event, and I wrote this poem to be read along with a poem that I had selected by Langston Hughes, which was a poem entitled Let America Be America Again. And so when you listen to this poem and reference to the land, you have to keep in mind Langston's poem, which on a number of occasions is a poem that Martin Luther King would quote. And that's, I felt, was a poem, one of Langston's best political poems. It's one of Langston's longest poems, and one that during the 1950s he deleted from his selected poems, which was pretty much because of the McCarthy period.
Before we get too far along here, I want you to read a love poem, because part of what you do really well is not only talk about family, but you have a wonderful way of introducing the subject of love into poems.
Well, I'll read this love poem, which is also about family.
Okay, good.
And combines the two. And this is a poem for my daughter, whose name is Jasmine Simone. And this is Jasmine. On my desk is a small bottle, which once held perfume. Inside is the cord that joined my wife and daughter. It is strange that I keep it. My mother kept my brother's sixth finger in a jar stuffed with cotton. One night I found it while secretly searching for cookies hidden in a drawer filled with underwear. Why do we keep things that are not ours? In another land, an old woman would take this cord and place it in the earth. Tomorrow, when my daughter becomes a woman, I will give her this small bottle filled with the beginnings of herself. On that day, she will hold love in her hands. And I think this poem takes us into the household. In many households, we find rituals that take place, the saving of the hair from the first haircut, you know, the first tooth and things of that sort.
Right.
And that takes place. The other thing, which is sort of ties into some of our poets here, 6 fingers. I think the poet Lucille Clifton was born with 6 fingers on both hands. Many times people feel that I think you have the gift of prophecy and foresight. And my brother was born with 6 fingers, which my mother saved in this jar.
Where's the finger now?
I don't know. You know, I just remember what happened. I used to eat all the cookies before my father came home, so my mother began to like hide them in different parts of the house, like some kind of game.
Yeah.
And so what happened? I would always be digging. I didn't even know what a bra was, you know, when I was a little boy, until I was looking for cookies, you know. And this is just a thing in which now I pass it on to the next generation in terms of a love poem for my daughter.
How about a new poem?
Okay, this is a poem that is new. In First Light, there is a poem entitled Rebecca, which is dealing with a woman who is battling breast cancer. Recently, I was reading in Nation magazine an article, actually a review of a book on breast cancer, which talked about how many of the people who battle it sometimes don't really win that battle. And so what I did was I went back to this poem about Rebecca, in which is a man adjusting to the fact that his wife has had a mastectomy. So now here's another poem dealing with the same relationship between Rebecca and Jim. The light on Rebecca's breast. Daylight falling on my chest. I placed Jim's hands on the pillow, where my head embraced his love. I rise and enter the bathroom where I walk through the door half closed. Enough space to realize my life with Jim is the reason I believe in miracles. I lace my sneakers after pulling on a sweatshirt and running pants. A morning ritual when I celebrate each new day as one of Thanksgiving and the counting of small blessings. The cancer will return, and I will not be able to outrace it or tell Jim that our lives are different but just as beautiful. Last night, when he looked into my eyes, I could only confess my fear. Just as now, I slip out for a morning run through the woods while he turns in our bed and his hands reach for something he can no longer touch. And that's a poem I wrote, you know, just recently. And there is this reference in terms of, you know, being ill, be out of the woods, you know. And I wanted to deal with a woman who is very concerned about her health, and she's exercising, trying to do all the things she can to stay healthy, but she also is battling, you know, an illness that comes back.
And is this typical of the new poems you're writing, or they?
Well, you know, the new poems, I guess, being honest, I've been writing more essays and more fiction than I've been writing poetry, and some of the reasons for that is that I've written a number of poems about my family, and now to further explore the topic or the theme, I feel that the essay is a better form. There's more I want to say. There's stories other than my own that I wish to include. I need to have my sister's view of my father. I need to have my brother's view of my father. And I find as opposed to writing a series of poems, you know, I can tackle it in an essay. And so that's what I've been doing.
Yeah, good. Well, Ethelbert, it's been wonderful chatting with you this afternoon about your poems and to hear about everything you're up to, especially the new poem which you read, which is terrific.
Well, thank you.
I look forward to seeing more new poems. And thank you for joining The Writing Life. We've been speaking with Ethelbert Miller.
Writing Life is a production of the Howard County Poetry and Literature Society, all rights reserved.